Sengupta. I'm absolutely delighted to have somebody join me from Paris in this conversation today. Someone whose book I read a few years ago, and it was called Jugaad. Many people read it. He and a bunch of others wrote that book. But Navi Radjou isn't only about being the author of that very famous book called Jugaad on frugal innovation. Since then, he's gone on to talk and teach around the world about conscious business, sustainable business, conscious living, really, and a better way to look at the world. I have invited Navi Radjou today to talk to me about the world he sees and the world that he wants in the future. Navi, thanks very much for joining me.
Thanks for inviting me, Hindol.
I want to begin, Navi, and I have to begin here because, for somebody as thoughtful as you, it would be wonderful to hear, living as you do in Paris now and having lived through really, riots which nobody thought would actually happen in the streets of Paris. How do you reflect on what's going on in that society, in that city? Because, as we were discussing just before this conversation began, while riots and this kind of violence and attacks constantly make news about from Paris, on another hand, there's all this talk about how that city is becoming cycling friendly, more environmentally conscious, and so on and so forth. And to me, that's a very interesting dichotomy about what can be papered over and what spills out as far as societies are concerned. Perhaps you could begin by talking to us about your thoughts on Paris.
Sure. So we should understand that France, actually, like India, is a land of paradoxes, and I think that's what you are referring to, right? This kind of this incredible paradox where, on the one hand, we saw a kind of a display, a traumatic display of violence in Paris. And other hand, we see also these cutting edge innovations to fight climate change. And as a matter of fact, it's called the Paris Treaty, right? The climate treaty. So it was signed in Paris. So and it's kind of interesting because what we saw actually in Paris recently is not something new, right? I came to Paris in the 90s. I studied here, and I've seen different waves of this kind of eruption of violence. But the source, the root cause of all this is a sense of marginalization, which is felt by predominantly, I would say, immigrants that came from the northern African part of like what's called the Maghreb, which could be Morocco and to a lot of extent Algeria. And in France, we have this famous term called integration. So it's kind of the melting pot, like in the US, where it doesn't matter where you come from, and you just have to kind of learn to speak the language. And language is important because that's kind of the indicator, the measurement to see how well you got assimilated into society. And the problem is that when these immigrants came, right from the beginning, rather than integrating them geographically within the cities like Paris, we kept them outside, what in the US we might call suburbs. So in the US, the suburbs is the kind of nice places where you want to go live as middle class. But in France, the suburbs became synonym with the underclass, the people who essentially didn't have any opportunities in the cities. So they were kind of relegated to a kind of second-class citizen status. And that has been going on, as I said, for about almost 3 generations now. So that's why we should put this, what happened recently in Paris, in its kind of historical context, where over many decades, this country has struggled to find a relevant way to integrate this kind of waves of immigrants. And I think what is happening right now is, in a way, so you do have, and this is important to note to create some nuance here. We see a lot of, and during COVID, this happened, by the way, is that a lot of kids living in the suburban areas, poor kids from immigrant families, ended up actually working as, for example, delivery boys. And during COVID, actually, thankfully, they are the ones who delivered groceries and food to the so-called middle class, who lived in Paris. So the problem is that these are like petty jobs, right? They are not, very stable. They're not well paid. So I think there is a kind of growing frustration among a large minority of people here that feel like essentially they will never get assimilated into the French society, even though they might be partially into the French economy, as I said, by doing these menial jobs. So that's one one part of the story. The other part of the story is the fact that in Paris, you're absolutely right. We have what I consider a progressive mayor, Anne Hidalgo, who actually is a person who is committed to, she's part actually, she was the head of the 40 cities around the world, the major cities that are committed to responding to climate change. So she wants to lead by example. So Paris has been indeed investing massively in dedicated pathways for bicycling, but also next year we have the Olympics in Paris, and that's supposed to be also an interesting opportunity to showcase French know-how in terms of building eco-friendly lodges, for athletes and things like that. So Paris actually, yeah, has been called the city of lights, but also it's a city of great paradoxes, which makes it, very interesting to live in.
One of the paradoxes, of course, Navi, is the state of the economy overall in Europe. Concerns about inflation, jobs, whether adequate technology advancement is happening, and so on and so forth. Now, you, of course, made your name first by writing this wonderful book on frugal innovation using an Indian Hindi language term called jugaad, which made news around the world. But I want to ask you a little bit about your other areas of interest, especially in conscious living. There are great concerns today about how far Europe, which was always seen to be a beacon in a sense of a particular kind of lifestyle, would be able to maintain that lifestyle considering the economic pressures and stresses that has unfolded around the world, especially after the Ukraine war. Talk us through how you're seeing this.
Yes, absolutely. Actually, in France itself, last year, a term that became very popular is the French equivalent to frugality, which is called sobriété. So it doesn't translate well in English because it means sober, but it's actually from a Latin origin. It makes sense because it's about actually sobering up. So it's actually understanding that the era of abundance is coming to an end, and we need to basically learn to consume and live more frugally. And that began with the energy crisis last year, where we had to, the government had to impose a 10% reduction in consumption of electricity, both for households and businesses. So that was a rude wake-up call. I remember how traumatized people were. I begin with this because first we have to accept that, the reality is that resource scarcity is not a theoretical thing. We saw that with energy last year. And this year, the major concern is going to be water. I grew up in the 70s in India when water was rationed. You know that very well. But I have a sense of deja vu, right? So we have 70% of France this year could be facing a water shortage due to drought. So that means that this year, French people are waking up to, the scarcity of water, which, by the way, could have, in the long term, well, medium term, devastating consequences for wine industry, which is another emblematic, right, of French culture. So that's why it's creating a kind of existential angst, because to be candid, right, unlike America, France is not known for profligacy. It's not a very wasteful society. Broadly, I mean, there is a sense of parsimony. People save a lot. right? Saving rates is very high in France. So you should caution, this caveat we have to note, the fact that, starting with France, right, and then we can talk about other European countries, that I think last year there was a wake-up call that we have to learn to live better with less. That's why this notion of conscious living. And that has actually not been too bad, because this is what I want to really convey this message across, right? Is that there's a difference between French people, citizens, and then the French kind of businesses and institutions. So the French themselves are relatively frugal. If you look at the consumption of different products, broadly speaking, we are not kind of as neither wasteful or as kind of consumerist as Americans. But there is a gulf between the citizens' habits and the businesses. So the real challenge is going to be more for businesses, public, private sector, and how they are going to essentially, do better with less. That means essentially having, on the one hand, natural resource scarcity. We talked about that. But then there's another ticking time bomb in France, and actually it already started in UK, but they had 12 years ahead of us to adapt, which is the fact that the public the public deficit is going to explode, right? That means that the government of France will have less and less money to spend at the time when, as you can imagine, right, the population is aging. We are going to have to create solutions for climate change, etc. So I think that's where you're going to see a lot of tension emerging in France in the public sector. Companies are, for example, like if you look at the buildings in France, I'm just baffled to see how badly insulated they are. In French, we call them passoires. That means that they are really bad during winter in terms of preserving energy and heat. So there is a lot of overhaul to be done in the public infrastructure and buildings and prudence in fiscal management, etc. But overall, the culture of France, I would say, is kind of well adapted for this frugality. But then if you go to other places, like, for example, in Germany, it might be a rude wake-up call. Believe it or not, they have actually even more generous social services kind of system than in France. And it's also aging much more rapidly than France, which has a high fertility rate. So I would say that the countries like Germany will have a rude awakening. Interestingly, UK, as you know, they already had the austerity era. So in a way, they are used to it, even though you might have seen recent news that there is also a lot of cuts expected in the public spending in UK coming up as well. But it's also the beauty of frugal innovation is that it's only when you face constraints, right, that you're forced to innovate frugally. And that's where I see, and I think I have to mention this, right? Essentially, what we are seeing is that, I got frustrated a couple of years ago because I've been promoting frugal innovation in Europe for several years now. And then starting last year, that's it. It's like takeoff phase, right? So you see UK, the national, health system, embracing frugal innovation. You see Germany, different regions setting up frugal innovation labs. And then in France also, there are companies, embracing it. So I think, there's a silver lining in this dark cloud, is that it's going to create a conscious living paradigm. We can discuss, of course, on the consumer side, but also get on the supply side, a lot of businesses, but also public sector to learn to do better with less by embracing these frugal principles.
Not just frugal innovation, but you've also been promoting for many years this idea that there has to be a certain consciousness in living and also in business, in doing business. And that actually sort of stems, in a sense, from a certain wisdom in leadership. Talk us through how you see this. What do you mean when you talk about conscious leadership, wise leadership in business? how can principles of consciousness be applied in doing business? How would you like to see this pan out?
Sure. I think the notion of consciousness essentially means having this awareness. We are all, web of interdependent beings, right? So we are all interconnected. And I start with this because, before we talk about, prakriti, nature, and, having this sense of, we are part of nature, which is very kind of popular to talk about today. I consider myself as a humanist before being an ecologist. So therefore, I think that being more conscious is to understand that we are not, an independent entity. We are all connected, the web of Indra, right, so to speak. So I think that's the first awareness that has to be in place. And then, of course, the second awareness is the fact that, we are not separate from nature. We are part of nature. So by preserving nature, in a way, we are preserving ourselves. And also by regenerating nature, we are regenerating our society as well. So I think these are the two aspects of, being conscious, is the sense of awareness, of being part of something bigger. But awareness alone, which in Buddhism is very, seen as a virtue, this kind of hyper lucidity is great. But this hyper lucidity not combined with compassion is useless. Right? So being super aware of what's happening is great, but a conscious leader is also, driven by compassion, and this compassion is what impels him or her into action. So when we talk about conscious leadership, there are three aspects of consciousness. And this is also where it's fascinating to see how different languages interpret consciousness differently. So in the West, consciousness is primarily mental, right? I think, therefore I am. So the awareness is purely mental, through perception. But if you look from, Indian and other traditions, I think consciousness has three dimensions, right? There is a thinking aspect of it, there's a feeling aspect of it, and there is a kind of an agency, the acting aspect, right? And therefore, a conscious leader, and this is why it's important, because we are seeing more and more around the world leaders becoming more conscious mentally about climate change. But I'm not sure all of them have this conscious feeling, right? This kind of visceral feeling that, we are part of a whole, let alone this active consciousness, right? The stuff that actually galvanizes you to act. And so conscious leaders would be people like Paul Polman, at Unilever, who started this program called Sustainable Living Plan in 2009, before climate change was a big issue. And so here's a person that actually, not only had an understanding of what's going to happen to the climate, to the planet, but he also created a plan to get the company to become one of the most sustainable company in the CPG sector by 2020, by reducing the carbon footprint by 50%, and by improving, the livelihoods of the small suppliers, like farmers that they buy from, while improving the health and the nutrition level of over 1 billion consumers worldwide. These were the three pillars of the Sustainable Living Plan that Paul Polman implemented at Unilever, and that actually become a big success. So I start that because now that is something great. It looks like a very American success story, right? But if you then kind of deconstruct this and just see what were the ingredients of success, here we identify different things. First, we identify the sense of compassion. Paul Polman was trained to be a priest, a Catholic priest. So in a way, he has this kind of heart open, and you can sense that when you talk to him. He's a person who is, very humane, very empathetic. So that helped. But compassion has to go with something else, which is sorely missing right now in the C-suite, which is courage. And one thing that made Paul Polman famous is that he pushed back investors who complained that he cares more about the planet than the company's profitability, right? So he had the courage to fight back, push back investors, actually got private equity investors to divest from his company, and he got more pension funds to invest in his company because they think more long term, and they think in a more sustainable way. So I think this courage is also important. You need to kind of have a strong belief, and you need to actually put your skin in the game. And I think that's what I don't see these days. What I see these days is a lot of leaders talking the talk, very rarely walking the walk. And that's why I came back to the 3 dimensions of consciousness, because, and I'm really worried about, because I see a lot of CEOs adopting the lingo of sustainability, like circular economy, regeneration, and these are all nice words, right? So it's a kind of a greenwashing, but a verbal greenwashing, right? But when it comes to action, I don't see that happening in many companies. That's why, and I'm publicly sharing this for the first time with you, with anyone actually. So I decided this year that essentially I will no longer do talks or consult companies, especially large companies, who are not aligning the actions with what they're saying publicly. And that is sad to say this, but because that's what's happening right now. There was a time when it was easier, right? You can say black and white, because certain companies would use lobbying to fight off, any kind of environmental standards and things like that. But now I see a more pernicious turn of events, where I see more and more big companies co-opting, the kind of the language of the ecologist, but not actually acting upon what they are saying in these public forums.
I'm glad you brought up this, this topic of greenwashing, because it leads me to the next thing that I wanted to discuss with you. Of course, there are concerns about big corporations, talking the talk, but not walking the talk, so to speak. The other concern that, especially in the global south, that has been expressed again and again, is the ability of the global north to, in a sense, weaponize many of the norms of ESG norms and other norms, without at the same time really stepping up to bring forth the kind of climate finance that would make these transitions equitable in the global south. And therefore, there's a lot of concern, including in India and other parts of the world, that in the absence of the finance that would actually allow these transitions to happen effectively without, affecting the incomes of millions and tens of millions of people, then it becomes almost like a weaponization of these norms, which the global north sort of unilaterally decides and everybody has to follow. I wonder what you think about that.
Sure. I think, first of all, the global finance, the financing generally, right? For example, we know that today the latest data from UN shows that there is a shortfall of $4 trillion in global south to achieving the sustainable development goals by 2030. And given the climate urgency, you're right, we need to step up in terms of impact investing and the different terms that we can use now. But I think you're right. I think the question is going to be, whether the ESG actually has been discredited. And you see all the backlash, especially in the US right now, among many Republican candidates running for the next year's election, right? And how they're lambasting not only ESG, but also the people who, like Larry Fink, right, at BlackRock, who has been actually a strong advocate for investing in companies that adhere to these sustainability standards, whether it's ESG or others. So I think that is what's happening. So clearly, there is no doubt, and several studies, including one by a French business school, has proven that the indicators used in the ESG benchmark actually are not just biased or falsified, but actually include even things that are not totally green. And that's when it started, creating a lot of mistrust in the ESG indicators. So I think there are two issues, right? One is whether these indicators apply primarily to a business environment that is specific to the West and therefore is not universal, especially for Global South. And then there's a second problem is that the so-called indicators that the North is promoting themselves are not credible, right? So what I've been thinking, and the UN itself, especially the UNCTAD, which is the trade and development arm of United Nations, as well as UNDP, which is also the development and investment arm of UN. They've been actually, Hindol, doing something interesting. So what they are saying is that their view is this: money is important, capital is important, so we have to figure out a way to raise more money. That's fine, and there are different ways we can go about doing it. But again, we go back to the frugal idea, which is how do you make sure that every dollar we are going to invest in fighting climate change goes a long way. And I think, for example, if you look at what UNDP is doing is very interesting, right? So what they have created something called the UNDP Accelerator Labs, which is present in 90 countries and supporting 115 countries worldwide. So what they are doing is that they are looking at which solutions actually work locally, to achieve these sustainable development goals. And then because they know it works, then it's easier for them to convince different financing partners to say, can we scale up the solution either locally or replicate that elsewhere? And this goes back to the notion that I've been promoting for 20 years, and I think it will be particularly relevant maybe for India, let me share this, is that I think it's time for financial institutions, it could be banks, it could be like private banks, it could be World Bank, it could be UNDP, etc., which view themselves as only the financier. So they have this self-perception as being very unidimensional, right? Essentially playing one role. Think like a movie, right? In a movie, you have one character, the hero, villain, and the side actor. So the financiers think that their role is to bring money. And I've been saying for many years that they need to play three other roles. Yes, you bring money, but you can also bring knowledge. You can bring interesting ideas. So that's the role of the inventor, which brings new business models, new paradigms for, deploying industrial development and things like that. And then there's a second role they have to learn to play, is the role of the transformer. This is what the UNDP Accelerator Labs is doing, is that they don't come, and this is the big problem with these foreign agencies, they think they're smart, and they bring a solution developed in New York and London, and then they try to do a pilot project in Africa and India, and that fails miserably. Instead, if you say, no, actually, I'm going to come with humility, see what works already locally, and then I'm going to transform, that is, I'm going to help scale it up, right? So that's an interesting other role they can play. And then the third important role is the role of a connector or like a broker, where they say, okay, so I'm going to bring like, $1, but then I can broker connections with other institutions, foundations and whatnot. And then collectively, we can invest in the solution that I've already validated with NGOs or other partners, right, in a particular region. So you can see that, this is why I think the real issue is going to be for the financial sector that invest in development programs is to become more versatile, more multidimensional. And that requires a complete change in their identity and maybe also new competencies, new kind of skills they have to develop. They can develop that themselves, homegrown, or they can team up. But the fact is that I think that the problem of achieving sustainable development goals and fighting climate change, I think it goes beyond just the issue of finding more capital, and it's more than just a financing problem, in my opinion.
One of the things you mentioned is very interesting, isn't it? On one hand, you correctly point out that all these problems, especially in measurement and assessment in ESG norms, have been discovered, are being discovered. People are questioning many of these norms. In the global south, there are questions about them being weaponized in an absence of finance being available. But at the same time, we should be wary of throwing the baby with the bathwater, because in America, for instance, if you use this as an excuse to completely dissociate from the very real and urgent danger that climate change poses for all of us, especially in a country, especially in the global north, which is the prime creators of the problem. It's the consumption of the global north, and indeed, a large part of the problem is America, where excessive consumption of all kinds, including of energy, has caused the problem in the first place. So if we use these the problems of the framework of ESGs to dissociate from trying to find any solution, we are going towards a very perilous future, isn't it?
Yes, but in America, remember that the motivation behind, especially the right-wing politicians, right, the Santis and others, who are actually kind of bedeviling and kind of belittling ESG, is because they believe in Milton Friedman's adage that the business of business is business. So it's the fact that essentially focusing on social issues, and this is very important because in America, the moment you say social, that's the realm of government and either federal or local, right? And business should not get involved in that, right? So it's only in the last 10, 15 years, right? And especially I would say with Obama, being the White House, when he set up this White House Office of Civic Innovation and Social Development, that actually we begin to see more companies, beginning to understand that they have a role to play. They have a corporate social responsibility. So what's really happening is not just ESG. This is what I'm saying is that so behind ESG, there is something, there's a tectonic shift that certain people in America are trying to bring in, is to say that the companies should completely get away from the involvement in social issues. Of course, they are thinking from a financial standpoint because it takes away the energy, efforts, and capital of the company that can be used to keep doing what they're doing, which is essentially developing product and services, and totally ignore the social issues. But where this is going to create a big problem is that, as Paul Polman said, is that a company cannot remain profitable it will be suicidal, he said, for a company to believe that it can be viable in a society that is collapsing, right? And let me give you certain statistics, because this is something that many viewers may be shocked to hear, right? 2/3 of Americans don't have $500 in the bank account to face a medical emergency, right? So it's just one among many shocking statistics. So what it means is that if businesses don't step up and do something about what's happening to the middle class in America, which is essentially getting poorer year after year, and this American dream, according to the Pew Trust survey, I've been studying every year for the past couple of years. What we are seeing is that the current generation of Americans think that American dream is just a dream. That means that the first time in 100 years, they think that the children will have fewer opportunities than their generation. They will be, financially poorer than who they are. So this is creating, it's actually creating, it's like a ticking time bomb, in my opinion, right? So this is why you're absolutely right. We should not throw the baby with the bathwater. And this is also where I come back to consciousness, because I think the reason viewers may not know that I left the US after living there for 22 years, and I came back to France for one main reason, and I never share this publicly, but I didn't find it morally right that when I was living in New York, especially during COVID, they had to pay $100 a month in medical insurance. okay? Because as you know, health insurance is privatized in US. Whereas in France, if I get hit by a car, in the street, I know that, an ambulance will pick me up and take to the hospital, and I won't, be bankrupt because I have to pay, the hospital bills. So that's why I think that in Europe, what I find interesting is that the social consciousness is relatively more advanced, especially among companies, but it's less so in the US. So that's why when we talk about the West, I just want to bring, some nuance that there is a growing gulf between even Anglo-Saxon. We say, UK and America. That's not true. There is there is the US, right, which is a whole world by itself, and then there is Europe. So that's why I think that if India and the global South is looking for allies to come up with that, maybe better indicators, better models of financing the sustainable development goals, I think they might find allies, in my opinion, more in Europe than the US.
To come to the end of this conversation, Navi, I want you to talk a little bit about the world that you would like to see. You just mentioned that after living in the US for a long time, you were born in India, you lived in the US for a long time, you lived in France, and then you came back to France for a particular kind of life, in a sense, a particular kind of thought about living, so to speak. Talk to us a little bit in conclusion about the world that you hope to see. You work with companies around the world. You train students in universities. You work with think tanks. What is the world that you would like to see?
I think the world I would like to see is what Sri Aurobindo talked about, right? In the ideal of humanity. It's a world where, we transcend the differences of being, even the term global South, global North goes away. We realize that, we are part of one humanity, which is facing what I call problems without borders, whether it's climate change, water, energy. We are all in the same boat. So this global awareness, in my opinion, this global consciousness, as I said earlier, has to be, transformed into action. And for me, the action would be that Annalise Saxenian, who is a professor at Berkeley, has written a lot about this notion of brain drain and reverse brain drain between India and Silicon Valley. And then she talked about brain circulation, this notion that essentially ideas have to travel, right, across boundaries. Because at a time when boundaries are coming back, right, countries are becoming more insular, more navel gazing, I think it's imperative that we learn to share ideas and knowledge across the world, and not just ideas and knowledge, but also wisdom. And this is where I would conclude by saying that this may be controversial, but since we are going to celebrate, 77th Independence Day in India in a few days, I have to say this, right? I think I'm a bit frustrated that, India is not taking a global leadership role in sharing its ancient wisdom, the richness we have in terms of philosophy, spirituality, etc., is extremely relevant today, right, to deal with these global problems we're facing. And I'm a bit frustrated by the fact that, India has declared this ambition to become a developed economy by 2047. But my dream would be that India also has an ambition or an aspiration to become a conscious society, by 2047. And this conscious society would not be to say like, we are better than the rest of the world. It's actually to become a role model, an inspiration for other nations to evolve into conscious societies as well. And this would be my dream, is that essentially we have this kind of a global exchange of ideas, knowledge, but also wisdom between East and West, because clearly I doubt China will try to do that, because they're embarking more in a confrontational posture vis-a-vis the West. But India has always been a syncretist. We absorb things from different sources. That's great. But I think being syncretist is not enough. It has to be complemented by being confident enough to share our wisdom, with the rest of the world, so that we can build a conscious humanity, in coming decades.
On that wonderful note, and on the promise of India, showing a new path to humanity, Navi Radjou, thanks very much for joining me from Paris. It was a real pleasure hearing your detailed views on a wide range of subjects, and I completely echo with you the dream and desire for a conscious humanity that could enrich every individual. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having me.